Before I go into specifics on those, I will just begin with a rundown on the advice I'd give in terms of CV structuring. Let me just roll through this quickly then, right? So maybe the unambiguous part, beginning with your full name, and as Chris writes on here, the pronunciation, if you want to include a guidance on that, that's optional. Pronouns optional, but good to make clear in slightly larger font your name to kick things off. We then move on to the summary. I agree with Chris. This should be kept for professional. I think there is room for talking about extracurricular stuff, but I would just keep this a more succinct and professional summary of your career and what you're looking for. This is a big one, the summary section, that people I find can overload and make too long over multiple paragraphs, and then also make far too specific. I would err on the side of this section not even being compulsory. A summary can often trip people up more than help them, because the summary might make a throwaway point about, so I would agree with this question that's just come up. I do not feel that the summary section is strictly necessary. I think if your CV if you're struggling to cut things down, I think a good CV can summarize a person through the experience mentioned rather than like a blanket paragraph at the top. I think when a summary is helpful is when a candidate knows, for example, that their CV in many ways isn't logically relevant, like they're doing an industry move. I then think a summary that owns that by saying, look, I'm looking to move into venture capital, from venture capital into real estate. I've had several years in financially driven companies. I know modeling well. I know what investors are looking for. I want to bring this into the property side. I then think a summary can be awesome in that context. I think when there's an overall comfort that your CV speaks for itself, you shouldn't feel the need to answer that question below to either include a summary and certainly not make it like over 6 lines or multiple paragraphs. Yeah, so that's my honest view on summaries. I find they can be a trip up as often as they're a net positive. When you do mention it and you still feel you want to have something on here, I encourage you to be really economical with it. I think that the example there is probably perfect, if not leaning on a bit too long. Make it a few lines. Make it specific, but do not say something like, I'm now exploring a role within European investment, unless you truly do mean it. I mean, if you just will not accept anything that budges from that geographical coverage, or it has to be transactions and that can't be portfolio or asset management or development, then of course do it. But if you're more open than that, please keep it simple and just say, looking for an ambitious business within real estate where I can continue to enhance my skills. You know, don't bite off too much in the summary section. Education should go here at the top when a candidate is in their first couple of years, particularly, and sorry to be blunt, when the education is impressive to employers. Say you know you've got a first class honours, or you know you've got a distinction or a merit. I think it's tactically smart to have the education higher up when probably that is still the more eye-catching thing compared to your first role for a year and a half, which might be at a more formative business. I think with education, you want to be specific again here, quite economical, your degree, the years studied, what you got. I also think it's a great idea to break down a module. So say you went to Henley Business School and you had a particular module where it was financial modeling for alternative assets. Make sure that's in there, ideally with an individual module grade. Another thing I love when people include is when they did a dissertation in something that is really interesting and massively relevant. So if someone has done a dissertation on like the net carbon goals of 2040 and how feasible it is for property companies to get there, as you know, to choose that for capex versus other things. Like, I think when something is very prescient and relevant and there's a dissertation with a great grade, I love it when candidates feel comfortable mentioning it. So to summarize, education is great, but be slightly tactical. If the grades are not what you would have wanted and you don't think there's a net benefit from it being this high up, I think it's great to go straight into work experience. If that's overall what you're proud of, you just want to get stuck in, then go straight into work experience. Don't feel you have to do it. But if you are proud of it and you're still on the more junior side and you're kind of compensating a bit for not having all of the professional experience yet, please have it at this point in your CV and just be as specific as you can about the grades. One thing I must share with you all, which I've just seen as an unfortunate fact of life, is when a grade isn't mentioned, the assumption made by hiring managers trends more towards the negative side. This can be really damaging when they're reviewing a number of applicants at once and they're not going to say, oh, let me just quickly check in with Damien because it doesn't mention the grade. They're just going to probably think on balance the grade wasn't what they needed. They might even over correct and think, oh, maybe they didn't even finish the degree or they fail. And so I'm actually a big fan of putting degree grades in rather than omitting them. I know it can be painful when it isn't what you wanted, but when lots of CVs are being reviewed, it could end up being more damaging than not. Where I think the flexibility comes in is exactly where the education part comes in on the CV, and that's where you can be a bit more tactical. Okay, I know I just got a question, so 1 second. Um, okay, so I want to know why UK employees insist on UK experience every time when real estate practice is similar all over the world. Yeah. Yeah, completely get this. Okay, yeah, this comment is very on the money. It is frustrating. I find that UK employers they fixate on it being experienced either in the UK or another thing I find is I think also Western and Southern Europe. There seems to be this attachment to a westernized kind of experience range and this assumption that if a candidate's modeling in kind of square meter versus square footage, it's an enormous mountain to climb, even if this candidate's gone to the best university in the US or whatever, right? So it's a bit nonsensical. But I have to agree that clients seem to be preferential when they can see a candidate has had kind of UK or European schooling, or they've done this asset here in Greater London versus this thing a bit further afield. What can you do about this? I mean, yeah, to an extent, there are some things here you just can't fight. I mean, you having a very clear, legible CV that makes your skill set as obvious as possible is clearly important when you know that, frankly, the country where you're applying for is not the country where your experience is in. So I think maybe one element I'd attack this from is it means the CV has to be really powerful. Yeah, and very detailed. It can't be ambiguous and also be geographically distinct. But another thing I think is helpful to do is that's where a personal statement I think actually can be helpful because then you can say, hey, I have 6 years from Nigeria within one of the leading developers. I've now moved to London. I have an extensive background modeling retail, leisure, office assets, factoring in many of the same assumptions that UK developers would. I now want to bring this experience to this market, having relocated to London. That's an example where actually a personal statement I think can be very helpful, if not necessary, and can maybe help you out in that instance. Because one thing I can't do in this webinar is with this question, act like it doesn't exist, because it 100% is a thing that I have to battle against every day. And I think the ways I've hopefully outlined here will just help you. And also having a recruiter like me that feels passionately about being inclusive with different backgrounds, because then you have another person that can help robustly explain your skill set and alleviate any concerns. One of the big concerns, not to waffle on this point, is this perception that modeling terminology is a bit different in different geographies. And they might just not know how to the imperial system versus this system, whatever. Like they might not be able to do it. And I think it's ridiculous, but I can't hide the fact that it is something that I get a lot. So that is one of two questions I've got. The second question is how necessary. Oh wait, no. Is my thoughts on adding scholarships in the school section? My thought is 100% yes. I mean, a scholarship is often a really positive reflection on the individual. So now I'm going into work experience. This is the bit that really is important. Okay, so with this section in work experience, I massively recommend you use bullet points, and I massively recommend you are very quantitative and fact driven in the experience you spotlight. For example, say you're in a deal team for a year. You want to mention that as closely as you can to the actuals, the deals you're doing, the geography, the asset type, who was it in JV with if you can, or was it in JV or not? What your specific role was on the deal. So rather than saying we, it's much better to refine your answer, be a bit less impressive, arguably, but go into I. So say there was a 200 million pound deal in PBSA in Frankfurt. And then a candidate might say, we did this and that, but the client doesn't buy into that. They'd rather know that, okay, I did the initial underwrite and I prepared like an investment teaser to explain the deal and the rationale behind it. I then ran a DCF cash flow to get to a levered and unlevered IRR, which I presented to the IC committee. Like it's better to have like a story connected to you than it is to say we all go into like qualitative paragraphs. Like the best CVs I open up, I read the work experience section. It reads a bit like a deal sheet does. Like it's really specific. It says like the square footage, the lot size, the asset class, your specific role. And I think if you're doing that and you're proud of a CV that really has the right amount of detail, you're in a really good position. The response or rebuttal I get to this often is, oh, I can't do that. I think it would be really unwise and frankly unethical to start labeling exact transactions I've done. And my response is, please don't feel you have to. I think like the city in Europe it's in, the type of property it is, what went into the model, did you have to factor promote? Hopefully that can be high level enough while still being detailed that you get away with it and you can still feel like you have quite a decisive CV. Okay. Another key question I get here, and we got it earlier to an extent, is what about when, frankly, you joined a company in a really difficult economic position and there weren't many deals? Naturally, it feels like there's not too much to shout about in general. I can understand that situation, and I understand that you might be grasping to an extent of what to say. In those instances, I would encourage people to still include examples, even when they did not complete, to include bids, appraisals, or include other things they did. I had candidates recently that mentioned they did more asset management centric work to stay busy and stay like a productive member of the team. So I'd resist the temptation to have a really short work experience section if that is what happened to you, and I would just find ways not of padding but of just doing justice to the work you are doing between the 8 hours you're there each day to still show relevant skill sets. So that's and yeah, I think we got here reverse chronological order. I would agree with this. I would say that you want to begin with most recent, and often I find people intuitively do this, but yeah, you want to begin with the most recent will always be prized the most. So yeah. The key skill section, the example here below is kind of as high level and ambiguous as you'd want to be. I think what's more powerful than this is having like Excel dash proficient at modeling from scratch to assess IRRs, both levered and unlevered. You know, what I said earlier, right? I think it's more powerful in this section to go into a bit more depth. But I think by and large, this is the right kind of approach. Like once again, in bullet points, easy to read, specific softwares that you can use. One thing I find a lot are skills. I think you've got to resist mentioning a skill when you only have partial knowledge of it. So say, I don't like it when someone says something like kind of intermediate user of Python or something like. I think it's fine to an extent, but if I'm being really picky, I think it's better to lead with skills you're confident in and you've done the work around, just in case it trips you up later. I think this also goes to an extent for languages. When I see languages mentioned, I see like GCSE German, this type of thing. I do think, okay, I get it. Like you basically have like an awareness of the syntax and grammar and the conversational side. But it can be damaging to mention it sometimes because you're up against people that are saying, you know, native and trilingual, and you almost don't want to enter the language arena without being ready to speak with confidence on it. So I think the one thing I'll caution you with on things like key skills and languages and stuff is really lead with what you have the genuine professional skill set in. Yeah, even if it's less. What we've discovered in this chat is having a CV at a good length is actually kind of challenging, and less is often more. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense there. Next, we go on to a bit about you and interest at the end. I think it's really important to have a couple of interests. I think it does massively help people. Just be aware that even though it's an extracurricular interest, it's still being read in a professional context. But certainly anything such as, you know, any instrument or sporting event or charity fundraise or like an interest, you know, I think it's really good to populate your CV with some of those because so often it is mentioned in an interview, and it actually is the difference between remembering someone and having that warm feeling and you know, just having a more clinical chat about deals and modeling and maybe not being as memorable. So I think it's actually really good to have an extracurricular section. Just obviously don't make it half the CV, like be specific. And if you are going to